Good afternoon. It's okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for attending this session. In the next 2 hours, we are going to focus in one of the most important topics, especially nowadays, that is the social responsibility at our universities and how we can face current challenges for a new future. In order to talk in depth about this topic, we have the pleasure to have with us 2 expert speakers. I'm going to present them. Dr. Jude Fransmann is an Open University Research Fellow and co-convenor of the Rethinking Research Collaborative, Chair of the Learning for Consortium Academic Board at British Overseas NGOs for Development. She has an interdisciplinary background spanning international community development, education and science and technology studies. She works at UCL, Institute of Education and Institute of Development Studies, and as a policy analyst for UNESCO and the OECD in Paris. Her research focuses on community-based research, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and the geopolitics of knowledge production. She works simultaneously at the local, national, and global level with a network of community-based researchers and the local government in a council style in Hungary, London, advising national research founders and policy makers on their community engagement strategy. We have here with us Thomas Farnell. He's a higher education policy expert at Institute for Development of Education, coordinator of the TCA project. He is the co-author of TEFC Toolbox, an institutional self-reflection framework for community engagement in higher education, and is also author of the recent report, Community Engagement in Higher Education Trends, Practices and Policies, published by the European Commission. He is currently leading 2 transnational projects to develop a European framework for assessing and supporting community engagement in higher education. He is a member of the European Commission Network Experts on the Social Dimension of Education and Training, NESED, and one of the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education expert team on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. So thank you very much for your time and for accepting taking part of this session. Together with me, as a chairperson, I present you Stephan Östlund. He is the Vice President for Global Relations at KTH. And myself, Gemma Fargas, I am the Director of the UPC Center for Development Cooperation. So, as Unite, we are working together in order to define a strategy that aligns the teaching activities and research to social demands. Very often, we are more worried about how to include the academic content in a cursor, or if the paper is going to be published or not, than the impact of our contribution to society challenges in terms of humanity and sustainability. So the first thing, the first starting points that we need to ask ourselves is all of these questions you can see in the screen. Sorry. I was not able to. Okay, here. Here you can see the questions that at the starting point we can ask ourselves. For example, how do universities teach? What is research useful for? Which is the university's social role? And of course, what kind of governance and management systems are useful to respond to this context? Moreover, all of these questions have to be answered in an emergency context regarding climate crisis and its socioeconomic consequences. Because, in fact, there is a need for ecological and social resilience that are linked to inequalities and social gap. So, in this sense, it's urgently needed to define the role of the higher education institution in sustainability development goals and global challenges. According to this context, the main objective of this session are to discuss on the social role of university facing new challenge, to identify ideas, experiences, and conclusions to develop a common strategy of social outreach for Unite, and to share experiences and proposals on how to measure and assess social commitment. In the last meeting, the Unite team that is working on Work Package 7 has identified some of the issues that arise when we are talking about social outreach and involvement of citizens in RRD. We have realized that we have a mess of terminology, that all of us have different understanding and implementation of SDGs as a common framework. And the consequence is that there is a huge diversity of initiatives from dissemination and to community engagement. So one of the questions is how of this disparity of social outreach strategies are comparable or not. And of course, how to measure the impact of these third mission strategies. So here we are grateful to see and to listen to our expert speakers. For sure, they can shed a light on these issues, and of course, that will help us to finally define a common strategy. So, without further dilation, I present or I give the floor to Jude Fransmann. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have to share my screen and then hopefully this will work flawlessly. Let's try. Okay. So I hope everybody can see this. If not, I hope somebody will interrupt me because I can't actually see the chat anymore. So please interrupt me with a shout if there are any problems or the slides aren't moving on or you can't hear me. But I just want to start by thanking you so much for inviting me to join this dialogue. And I'm so very sorry that I can't be with you in person. I was extremely excited to learn about the Unite initiative, especially sitting here in cold, grey England. And I have in my notes to insert a joke about Brexit, but honestly, I can't really think of anything funny to say about that. So I'll leave it. Anyway, today I'm going to be discussing some of the implications of complex, collaborative and transnational programs like Unite for a new type of social responsibility in higher education. And in response to the introduction, I'm not sure how much light I'm going to be able to shed on some of the complex terminology that is being used, as I think this is part of the problems that we're all grappling with in different ways. But hopefully I'll be able to raise some questions and challenges to further the discussion. But before I start, I want to give you a little bit of background to my own work, because my disciplinary background is in anthropology, and I believe it's important to be explicit about our positionality. So for the past 20 years, I've worked in research at a number of levels. At the global level, working for international policy organizations and with transnational networks of academics, civil society practitioners, social movements, and policymakers. At the national level, working primarily with British and Canadian research funders and policymakers. And at the community level, working with community-based researchers in my local social housing estate in London and with our municipal government. And today I'm going to draw on these experiences, and particularly the experience of engaging different types of research stakeholders at and across these different levels, to reflect on the meaning of social responsibility for a more distributed type of university. So I hope you can see this next slide. Again, interrupt me if you cannot. I want to start by highlighting the strategic context in which the Unite project is situated, and in particular, 3 dimensions that make this type of initiative so important. It's clear that the large-scale, intractable social and environmental challenges, such as the current pandemic and the climate crisis, demand new approaches to knowledge mobilization through teaching, research, and innovation that are complex, so spanning multiple geographical regions, disciplines, and professional sectors of policy and practice. Collaborative, involving those most affected by new social and environmental challenges and best placed to address these challenges, as well as other relevant centres of expertise. And adaptive, so responding to rapidly changing issues and contexts, as well as to new learning. There's therefore enormous potential for a complex, collaborative, and potentially adaptive, certainly learning-oriented initiative like Unite to break new ground in response to such challenges. So in this talk, I'm going to start by using an example of a particular global representation of academic knowledge to challenge some of the assumptions that we commonly hold about equality, diversity, inclusion, and social responsibility, and to raise some questions about how Unite positions itself between the global and community levels. I'm then going to present some different models of social or community or stakeholder engagement that other transnational networks have developed to illustrate some of the different ways they have worked across different societal levels and research and innovation systems. And finally, I'm going to turn to complexity theory to propose a systemic approach to understanding social responsibility for a distributed university like Unite, and to explore the implications for practice and policy. So I want to start by raising a more general point about the challenges of an equity or social responsibility agenda, particularly in complex and interconnected contexts. I'm sure you've all seen this sort of map. It's a representation of the global distribution of Web of Science citations, and it's clearly quite provocative, demonstrating quite stark inequalities in the production of research outputs. But the point I want to make is about the type of assumptions that this sort of representation makes. For instance, that certain regions in the world lack research capacity, and also the type of policy responses that might follow. For instance, that these lower capacity regions should collaborate under the leadership of higher capacity regions in order to advance in the system. What I want to put to you is how different this map would look if it included those outputs that were not, for example, written in English, or those individuals who have been involved in implementing or contributing to research but have not been credited as a co-author, or all the research that has been published as policy reports or practitioner toolkits instead of in peer-reviewed journals. So representation is really important. And while allegedly highlighting inequities and inclusions, representations like this one are also legitimating both a particular type of research and innovation system, which privileges a particular type of research output, but also a broader system of metrics, presenting itself as universal while serving the interests of a particular type of science, which evolved in certain contexts and may be less aligned, for example, with African interests. I think when we go on to discuss assessment and evaluation, as Thomas will be doing shortly, it is important to bear this sort of representation in mind. So with this complex geopolitical context, there is an increasing number of transnational networks who, like the Unite initiative, have turned to a collaborative approach to challenge some of the limitations of national and global research and innovation systems. I'm going to present a few examples which give a flavour of the different ways that they have positioned themselves in relation to these systems. So first, the African Academy of Sciences is a Pan-African research funding council with a primary agenda of establishing or recognizing African science on the global stage. So the AAS really positions itself in line with mainstream global science and does not yet engage with less traditional community-based research initiatives, even though the research agendas that it focuses on respond to African interests. But it does have a very strong equalities agenda, and it works to redress regional inequalities in higher education across Africa. Second, the Praxis Institute of Participatory Practices is based in India, but it has developed a network of community-based ground-level panels across 6 countries as a counterpart to the high-level panels responsible for setting the agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. These panels identify different interpretations of the themes of the goals and different sets of languages, for example, around climate justice instead of climate action. Third, the UNESCO Chair Platform in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education, whom I think many of you may know, has developed the Knowledge for Change programme, which is a network of local knowledge hubs or grassroots partnerships between universities and community-based organisations across the Global South and excluded North, which includes certain marginalised European and North American contexts. These hubs are scaled up regionally and globally through learning events in which the different participants can share experiences and co-create learning responses to this new, more engaged way of mobilizing knowledge. And finally, the Pan-African social movement, Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, has developed citizens' assemblies across 5 regions of Africa to co-design a participatory index for justice, peace and dignity, which forms the basis of research, learning and activism initiatives across the country. And these resources will be available soon. So all of these networks are members of the Rethinking Research Collaborative, which is an international network of networks that I co-convene, and including academics, civil society, practitioners, policymakers, funders, all committed to critically rethinking research systems from global to community level. So there's significant potential to work collaboratively across multiple contexts. However, there are also challenges, and these include, navigating the interdependence of context. So the challenge of having to keep in mind when working at one level that there will inevitably be implications for the other levels. And secondly, when thinking about engagement or inclusion, the tendency to look from inside the formal research and innovation system at ways of incorporating different groups or perspectives into that system, as opposed to looking at the knowledge, practices and needs of groups outside of that system who are implicated maybe in other knowledge practices. There's also a tendency to frame engagement as, or even collaboration as universally positive, when actually in some instances it can be very damaging, not least because of the huge demands that it puts on people's time and emotional energy, which disproportionately affects more marginalized participants. There's also a tendency to focus on the positives, consensus building and success stories, and an inherent discomfort in acknowledging conflict, as well as fear of failure, which is exacerbated by institutional mechanisms, both for career progression and for research accountability. Given the huge demands on everybody's time, we also tend to focus on making the best of the existing system, rather than aspiring to alternatives or imagining new ways of being. In our transnational network of networks, the Rethinking Research Collaborative, we spend some time using creative methods like science fiction prototyping to explore alternative international development futures, for example, and perhaps this is something that Unite might also engage in. And finally, any significant change demands an update in capacity, which can involve unlearning as much as learning. Our system thrives on a particular idea of expertise that individuals preside over and defend their mini knowledge empires. With a move to more commercializable research, there's even more incentive to produce and promote methods, toolkits, technologies as widely as possible to demonstrate impact. But context change and approaches become more or less relevant. So I think we have to become better at letting go of some of those frameworks and looking to others, even if they don't fall within our particular area of research or expertise. And this is why being part of a collaborative network and sometimes contributing to other people's research as well as promoting or advancing your own is a great opportunity. So how can we use these challenges to think systemically about inclusion and social responsibility? The blue wheel at the center of this figure represents the research and innovation system. This includes agenda setting and governance, research design and implementation, communication, and the use and impact of research. It might look slightly different for our teaching systems, but I see both teaching and research as part of the university's broader knowledge mobilization role, which also includes third mission activities. In the white boxes, I've modified 4 concepts from complexity theory, and I think might be helpful for thinking through social responsibility within the system. So first, by considering the starting conditions or the framings of the system, we're asking about where these agendas come from, where they're grounded. Are they framed by our domestic policies, our institutional policies, European policy or international policy like the Sustainable Development Goals? What types of values or ideologies are embedded in these assumptions? In a paper published earlier this year, with colleagues, I unpacked this in relation to a major UK funding initiative, the Global Challenges Research Fund, but it could also apply to any initiative and is particularly interesting to think about in a distributed context where several different sets of framings are brought to the mix by each of the participating countries and universities. Second, by considering context, we're asking about the other systems with which this particular system is engaging. How is it acting on existing hierarchies and knowledge production practices in different places? For example, a well-intentioned fellowship program to build capacity of African researchers might actually end up exacerbating regional inequalities by supporting a small pool of elite researchers and organizations. Similarly, collaborations that involve giving significant funds to individual community-based organizations without considering the broader political economy within which they're operating can undermine local networks and place-based movements. And just as an aside, context doesn't only have to be social, but it also could include environmental impact. In the UK, we've started to talk about this as GRIMPACT. So the GRIMPACT of initiatives on the environment. This is why a careful stakeholder or political economy analysis is a crucial first step in planning any initiative, and funders can support this by resourcing collaborative design phases to identify stakeholders and map contexts, or providing space within funding applications for applicants to address some of these difficult issues and highlight their engagement strategies. Third, we often think of communities as groups with similar attributes, but even the most locally place-based and superficially homogeneous groups will have stark differences. For example, in our small action research hub in our North London Council estate, participants have different migration status, employment, welfare, housing circumstances, as well as being different ages, genders, ethnicities, speaking different languages, being differently abled, etc. But difference is an opportunity and not an obstacle, because it is the tensions between these differences that power can be observed. An analysis of what needs to change can be made. Difference also goes hand in hand with dialogue. And in a transnational initiative, this will mean carefully considering the languages and accessibility of technology, the consistency of research and teaching practices, and how these interact with different institutional and national policy systems, each of which will have their own hierarchies and equality, diversity, and inclusion considerations. There's also the opportunity to recognise and create new research, teaching and learning identities, which might not align with those shaped by our national and institutional systems. For example, bringing community-based experts into our teaching and research spaces, recognising and engaging with research and teaching initiatives being undertaken by other organisations outside of higher education, and enabling non-traditional career trajectories that might be more accessible for certain groups. And finally, in any work informed by an equity agenda, we are always aspiring to change, but systems are also always changing themselves, whether in response to the climate crisis or pandemics or new technologies or a changing government. A quick example from my work with the Institute of Community Studies and the British Academy in the UK is around how British communities became both more hyper-localised and also digitally distributed through the pandemic, with implications for new types of inclusion and exclusion. So this is an ongoing set of considerations. So I'd just like to end with some final thoughts for how university staff might use systemic thinking to engage in a more socially responsible way. So first, be explicit about framings and recognise any tensions between them and the assumptions within them, whether around global challenges, SDGs, principles of inclusion, equity, climate justice, or social responsibility. Secondly, critically engage with your multiple contexts and consider the effect of any interventions on context and stakeholder populations at other levels. Whoops. Oh, I'm not sure what happened to the rest of my slide, but I will continue. Sorry, just that final part. Thirdly, explore how different groups are represented and participate in all parts of teaching, research and innovation systems, from being included in strategic agenda setting right through to evaluation. And this has implications for the types of new practices, artifacts, structures, processes, policies, capacity that is needed. And finally, work to developing long-term emergent collaborations with sufficient time for context analysis, relationship building, anticipation, and responsive adaptation and learning. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now so I can hopefully see everybody again. And I hope everyone could hear me.
After this presentation, might be time for some questions already now directly related to the presentation, Jude. So, anyone in the room? No? Yeah, Arnold Pierce.
Arnold Pierce, thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I was really interested in your visualizations of how data can represent or reinforce existing inequality. Oh, okay. Sorry, do you hear me better now? Oh, you probably heard me well enough from the beginning. I'll try and tone down the voice into the microphone then. So my question was, in what ways should we work to regulate these types of representations so that they become more representative and more equal? I think we need to reconsider how we represent outputs. But what are the concrete mechanisms that we should be considering?
That's a great question. I hope everyone can still hear me. So I think there are a lot of initiatives which are doing just that, working to try to make representations of research more inclusive. For example, I think there's a transnational centre called the Research on Research Institute, RORI, and they have partners across Europe and North America, and in fact the African Academy of Sciences is a partner, and they're working with various institutions. I think Leiden has the Centre for Responsible Research Metrics to look at ways of broadening out these metrics so that they are more representative of actual contributions to knowledge, not just citations that happen to appear in these indexes. I think it's important to say, though, that there's a limit to what these types of more inclusive initiatives can do. There are certain practices and certain knowledges that will simply not be captured by these type of indices, however expansive they become. And so I think we have to work at these two different levels. We have to work with kind of formal traditional policy to improving the representations and structures, and then we have to work at the other end of the spectrum, at the grassroots, through other types of, whether social movements or networks of community-based partnerships with universities, to look at how the types of knowledges that are going to continue to be invisible even in these more inclusive metrics. I hope that responds to your question.
Thank you very much. Any more questions right now? Otherwise, I think the second speech will actually touch upon this more in detail. So I hope we'll have a good combination of speeches. I think it's time for Thomas to do your part of it. Oh, is the video? Yes. Yes, okay. Sorry, I missed that. We have put together a video with some examples of societal outreach at the different universities of Unite, and I was told that will be shown right now. And it's coming.
Kun lukee kirjoja, ja sit mä tykkään fantasiakirjoista, ja niissä monella päähenkilöllä on sellainen fiilis, että mun pitää pelastaa kaikki. Ja sit mä oon silleen, hero complex, mikä homma. Mut sit kun katsoo itteensä, niin kyllä se on kuitenkin kans se, että kyllä mä haluan pelastaa maailman ja kaikki. Aallossa on mun mielestä just se vahvuus, että sit kun täällä on niinku näin paljon ihmisiä, niin me saadaan isoja muutoksia. Ei pelkästään se, että mä kierrätän himassa roskat. Mulle on jäänyt mieleen erityisesti se, että jos ei ole silleen ökyrikas, niin sitten parhaiten sitä maailmaa saa muutettua sillä, mitä tekee töissä, koska töissä viettää tosi ison osan ajastaan. Opiskelijan työtähän on se opiskelu, ja mun mielestä on hyvä, että sit kun Aalto tekee tällaisia strategia-asioita, niin sitten ne tulee sinne opiskelijan arkeen sellaisiksi pinnalla pitäviksi asioiksi ja sellaisiksi niin taustalla oleviksi jutuiksi, että opiskelija pystyy keskittyä siihen, mitä opiskelija tekee, eikä tarvi uida vastavirtaan, jos haluaa tehdä asioita kestävästi, vaan meillä on rakenteet ja kulttuuri, että se niin kuin kannustaa siihen. Mä haluaisin ehkä olla sellaisessa asemassa tulevaisuudessa, että mä pystyisin just tekemään sellaisia isoja skaalautuvia juttuja. Keksiä jonkun teknologian tai kehittää jotain teknologiaa, jolla joka pystyy ottaa laajasti käyttöön. Ja että se parantaisi ympäristöä tai ihmisten elämää.
Hello, my name is Simon Roman, and I did a bachelor thesis project on KTH, which was named Production of Biochar from Urban Garden Waste. And I, together with my colleague John Henry, did it in collaboration with the municipally-owned housing company Stockholmshem, which they own a lot of apartments around in Stockholm where they produce garden waste. And this our aim was to see how they, in the most environmental friendly way, could produce biochar from this garden waste.
Okay, so like Simon mentioned previously, we worked with biochar, and as you can see here, Simon is holding some biochar in his hands. And to the untrained eye, that may look a lot like charcoal, and it is a lot like charcoal, but what differentiates it is how it's used. So biochar is not burnt for energy. Instead, you use it as a product For example, here in this garden, it could be used as a soil amendment, where it improves the soil properties when you dig it into the ground, and at the same time, when you dig it into the ground, you bind atmospheric CO2 in the ground, so you get negative emissions of CO2. And what we found in our study with Stockholm SAM was that this practice for them could be very beneficial environmentally and economically, and therefore we think it's something that more housing companies should look into.
Ciao, sono Andrea Borgo, ho 24 anni e sono uno studente di Ingegneria dell'Ambiente e del Territorio al Politecnico di Torino. Nel mio percorso di laurea ho avuto modo di studiare a fondo le tematiche riguardanti il cambiamento climatico, i metodi per monitorarlo e le strategie per mitigarne gli effetti. In occasione del Festival dello Sviluppo Sostenibile 2021 ho potuto partecipare al Mappathon, le università al servizio della cooperazione internazionale. Una bellissima esperienza di mapping rivolta agli studenti universitari di diverse città italiane, organizzata da ASVIS e RUS, in collaborazione con UN Mappers e SDSN Italia. L'attività è stata strutturata come una sfida collaborativa, in cui le diverse squadre partecipanti avevano l'obiettivo di mappare su OpenStreetMap una zona rurale del Madagascar. Il Ministero dell'Educazione del paese sta lavorando insieme a UN Mappers per mappare tutte le strade di quel territorio, tramite l'utilizzo di immagini satellitari, così da poter meglio pianificare il trasporto degli studenti tra casa e scuola, le visite di controllo e la consegna di libri di testo. Dopo un primo momento di formazione, ognuno dei partecipanti ha scelto un'area in cui mappare e in 2 ore doveva tracciare più strade possibili, distinguendo tra strade principali, strade minori, sentieri e tracciati ad uso agricolo e forestale. Il Mappathon è stato un successo perché c'è stata una grandissima partecipazione di noi studenti, che abbiamo mappato più di 4.500 km di strade, circa 53 per partecipante. Sicuramente già un buon numero che permetterà ai decision maker locali di pianificare meglio le loro strategie sul territorio. Sono molto contento di aver preso parte a Mappathon 2021, non solo per aver contribuito concretamente ad un progetto di cooperazione internazionale, ma anche per aver scoperto una realtà che non conoscevo per nulla, il ruolo del mapper come figura di cooperante. Sono sicuro che, una volta terminati i miei studi qui al Politecnico, questa esperienza influirà sul mio futuro nel mondo del lavoro.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephan and I recently completed my Masters in International Cooperation and Urban Development under Urbano from Technical University of Darmstadt and International Cooperation and Urban Planning from University of Grenoble Alps. I would like to take this opportunity to share an experience of an international workshop I attended in 2020. The workshop aimed at providing design solutions for the Grenoble metropolitan area to a joint organization that is responsible for the Grenoble Territorial Coherence Scheme, the SCOT. First, the participants were divided into different groups, and the SCOT presented on the current scenario in the 3 regions. Participants then visited the 3 communes, conducted interviews with the mayor and the residents of the 3 regions. Planning documents were also reviewed. And in the end of the workshop, presentations were given by the participants, the SCOT as well as the teaching staff. These proposals were integrated by the SCOT in their planning proposals for the region. I think given the chance, it's a good opportunity for students to attend such international workshops.
Hi, I'm Laura Patricia. I'm a multi-urban student at the TU Darmstadt and the University of Rethinking. In 2020, I participated in the Grenoble International Workshop in Master Urbano, where we worked with the organization SCOT. We got to learn a little bit about the project, visit the municipalities, and learn about their history and their current situation. Finally, by working in teams, we decided and presented some models of conceptualization and implementation of polarities for each municipality in front of members of the SCOT organization and the mayors of each municipality.
No ano letivo 2018-2019, os alunos da primeira edição do Doutoramento de Ciências da Sustentabilidade foram desafiados a elaborar uma proposta de modelo de planeamento municipal para o abastecimento local dos refeitórios escolares de um município assente em princípios de sustentabilidade e resiliência. O município escolhido foi Almada, que é um município a sul de Lisboa, e através de uma abordagem de problem-based learning, além da análise crítica da informação pública disponível, foi possível recolher dados e consultar diversos atores e stakeholders e contar também com a colaboração de técnicos da Divisão de Educação desse município. Além disso, a proposta final foi também apresentada à Presidente da Câmara Municipal. O doutoramento de Ciências em Sustentabilidade é, por isso, particularmente adequado para pessoas que, como eu, desenvolvem simultaneamente uma atividade profissional ativa, que beneficia da transição do conhecimento multidisciplinar para uma integração transdisciplinar, que inclui resposta a problemas reais, como vantagens resultantes desta experiência, saliente principalmente a possibilidade de aplicação prática de conceitos teóricos à realidade e o sentido de propósito associado à utilidade do trabalho realizado, consubstanciando uma ligação de duplo sentido entre a academia e a sociedade.
Hola, em dic Irene i soc enginyera civil. L'estiu passat vaig tenir l'oportunitat de participar en un projecte de cooperació internacional a Moçambic, aquest país d'aquí, i vaig anar a analitzar quins són els impactes socials que està tenint el canvi climàtic sobre la capital, sobre Maputo. Per això vaig fer servir una metodologia basada en entrevistes, amb les quals vaig parlar amb diferents agents tant locals com nacionals, com per exemple el Ministeri de Terra i Ambient o alguns tècnics de l'Ajuntament i fins i tot associacions socials locals o la ràdio de la ciutat. Una de les coses que em va impactar més va ser el fet que algunes solucions tecnològicament viables i adequades, a vegades per motius culturals o socials, no ho són tant. I per tant, com a enginyers i enginyeres, crec que hem d'aprendre a considerar també tota la part social a l'hora de dissenyar noves tecnologies.
Em dic Pol Quartero i Parreu, soc estudiant de 5è grau a l'Escola Tècnica Superior d'Arquitectura de Barcelona. El 2020 vaig matricular-me a l'assignatura optativa anomenada Habitatge i Cooperació, la qual va participar a la Mapaton d'Accessibilitat, un projecte que pretén identificar i exposar els problemes i necessitats respecte a l'accessibilitat de l'espai urbà, i on hi participen ajuntaments, entitats i estudiants. És una gran experiència, ja que problemes menors als quals no donem importància o no prestem atenció, per a altres persones poden ser problemes molt grans, els quals són urgents d'arreglar.
Okay, so
kun lukee kirjoja, ja sit mä tykkään fantasiakirjoista.
Okay, so we move on to and give the floor to Thomas Farnell. As we present him at the beginning of the session, he's a higher education policy expert at the Institute for Development of Education. So please.
No, this is fine, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here, so thank you very much for inviting me. And the talk I'm going to give is a follow-up to the great two sessions, the two presentations we've just heard. The first one by Jude about the larger issues of how we as universities address these crucial problems that we're facing as societies, and how to address some of these issues that come up with engagement and some inequality that happens in that process. And I'd like to commend the organizers for putting these videos in between, because I think that's such a great way of showing, of contextualizing what we're doing in your specific context, and showing the range of different ways in which, as universities, as students, we can engage with external communities for mutual benefit. And so the topic of my conversation is, this is all great, but how do we measure this? And I will be offering a solution to all your problems with a framework that we've developed for community engagement in higher education. I am joking, but I do hope the presentation will at least open some good questions for discussion and to see whether this could help your European University Alliance in addressing some of these questions. So we've called it a European framework for community engagement in higher education. What does the term community engagement mean? We define it in the project that I will be presenting as being about how universities address societal needs in partnership with their external communities. So it's important to define what we mean by community, what we mean by engagement, and what we mean by societal needs. So by the term community, perhaps in slight contrast to how Jude in one of her slides presented it, the community as maybe necessarily local, we in the project that we've been working on, we paint it as a much broader picture. So community can go from government to business to civil society, and it is of course at the local level, but it can also be global. And I think that the examples you've just seen in the previous videos show that you can be engaged with external communities in other countries. So engagement is about mutually beneficial joint activities that are carried out with external communities. So this is quite crucial. It's not about the university helping others. It should be about universities working with others so that both sides benefit in that process. And finally, societal needs. Maybe in some discussions about community engagement, there's an assumption that we're talking about social justice and only social justice. Again, we think that it's more productive to think of this in a much broader sense so that you can have community engagement related to political, economic, social, cultural, technological aspects that impact our quality of life, so that we paint this as the broadest possible picture. So the issue of terminology, so we've heard about universities, social responsibility, engagement. The topic of terminology is problematic in the English language. As you can see on this slide, there's many different terms that we use to talk about these issues, whether it's knowledge exchange, the third mission, the local mission, the civic university, and let alone in different languages, right, around Europe. There is no way that we are all using the same terms for this. What we are proposing in the work that we've done on this topic is that the term community engagement, as defined in the previous slide, can be one that acts as an umbrella term. So essentially what we're arguing, maybe people will not agree with me, that we are essentially talking about the same thing with some nuanced differences. So why is this topic important today in the European context? So in the past, let's say we can say in the last few decades, talking about this third mission of higher education has been primarily and overwhelmingly focused on cooperation with industry, technology transfer, commercialization of research, and so on. This is changing. And in the last few, I'm sorry that the representative of the European Commission isn't here with us today, but in the last few key strategic documents coming out of Brussels in the area of higher education, we're seeing more and more reflections of this in the language that they use. So we're talking about societal challenges. They use the term civic universities in their renewed agenda from 2017. Very interestingly, last year, the new document on the European higher education area, on developing a European education area, they talk about innovation as the third mission and service to society as the fourth mission of universities. I think the European Commission is the only institution that's used that term, but I like the fact that they've come up with it as a new way of framing this important topic. And of course, in research, this has maybe gone on for a bit longer through the Horizon 2020 previous Horizon program, where there was a whole segment devoted to science with and for society and supporting citizen science. And okay, in the broader international level, as you've been discussing already, I'm sure at the conference, that the whole framing of the Sustainable Development Goals is increasing the focus on this idea of what's the role of universities in dealing with these challenges. The last point in this slide is about COVID-19. COVID-19 makes everything much more complicated for everybody at universities, and it makes engagement more difficult too. However, there's an argument that can be made that it's actually increased the expectation of universities to step up and to act in addressing the huge range of societal challenges that we'll be facing as an impact of COVID-19 and as direct responses, and which we've seen in practice that universities have done, whether it's getting involved in policy debates about vaccinations, whether it's actually developing vaccines themselves, protective equipment, and so on. So this is a topic, whether we like it or not, this is happening. And now the question is, when something reaches the policy agenda, in any form, the immediate follow-up question, which is very logical, is, okay, how do we measure this? How can we evaluate whether we are good at this, where we can do better, and how we can improve? And in higher education, the typical way in which we talk about measurement and performance is in this way, that you develop guidelines, standards, key performance indicators or such like, and then you check whether you've met those, whether it's through accreditations, audits, benchmarking, evaluations, and so on. And of course, there's one word missing from that right column. I'm wondering if you can guess which one it is. It's one that's looming over the higher education sector worldwide, and that's ranking, of course, because there's whenever there's something that needs to be measured, there's a huge temptation to create a ranking and a league table of universities to see whether we're meeting these goals. And I thought a few years ago, well, there's no way they're going to make a ranking for community engagement. And here comes Times Higher Education with their new impact rankings, which is not exactly about community engagement, but it's about how universities are contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's another initiative that's taking place with King's College London, University of Chicago, and others to develop a methodology for ranking community engagement as well. So, is this a good idea? The argument that I would put, in short, is that it's not a good idea, and this is why. So, how can you measure community engagement in higher education? The answer is that the short answer is that we don't think you can. There's no one-size-fits-all approach of dealing with this topic because, and this Jude has also talked about in her presentation, about the importance of context. So the way in which a university will engage with external actors and organizations and citizens will completely depend on what kind of a university they are, what disciplines they're focused on, where they're located, who their external communities are, what their resources are, and so on. So there's very little value, we would argue, in comparing how a university as Central London is engaged compared to a university in a rural part of Catalonia. So in that sense, what's the value of finding a one-size-fits-all approach? We don't see it. The second is a more practical issue, is that people have tried to come up with indicators and metrics for community engagement and have not succeeded in doing so. That is, they've come up with something that hasn't really worked or that hasn't really been applicable, and that people involved in this area have said, look, if there were any sensible metrics for community engagement that existed, somebody would have invented them already. And this is, if we're looking at the European context, this becomes even more complicated because you're operating in a transnational context. So finding a European set of metrics for community engagement in higher education would also make that increasingly, incredibly difficult. But maybe the more important question we have to ask ourselves is, why do we want to measure things? And why would we want to measure community engagement in higher education? And surely, it should be about allowing universities to identify what they're doing in terms of community engagement, to really to take stock, to map everything that they are doing, to help them understand how well they are doing community engagement and demonstrate the value that this engagement brings both to the university and to external communities. And hopefully also then to see what are we not doing so well and how could we improve in the future. And I think it's very difficult to see how a metrics-based system could do this. By the way, an aside, I approached the impact rankings of Times Higher Education with an open mind. I was really willing to be surprised by the value that it would bring me. if you look through those rankings and you actually try and find out why the University of Auckland is like the first, I think, according to those rankings, you can't find any information. So you find their score and you find the areas in which they got their scores. You can't find out what were those projects that brought value, what impact they had. So it's a reputational exercise. It doesn't bring value, or you cannot learn from that tool in any way, I would argue. I'm willing to discuss this. Okay, so we, as a project, enter this arena then in this context. And we are the following. I am leading 2 overlapping projects as European initiatives responding to this area of community engagement in higher education. The first is a project that ended a couple of weeks ago called Towards a European Framework for Community Engagement in Higher Education, or TEFC for short. And the second, which is now going on until 2023, is Steering Higher Education for Community Engagement, or SHEFC for short. Okay, in short, the 2 projects encompass partners from around Europe, north, south, east and west, including partners in Catalonia, the University of Girona and the Association of Catalan Public Universities. And we're very pleased that in the SHEFC project, so the more recent one, that we've attracted the interest and partnership of key institutions at the transnational to local level. So we have the Council of Europe, the European University Association, the OECD involved as associate partners. At the national level, we have the NCCPE from the UK, which is the main organization for supporting universities and being community engaged, campus engaged in Ireland, and in each of the partner universities, local city councils as well. So what have we done? We have developed, in response to the issues I mentioned a few slides earlier, the TEFC Toolbox, which is an institutional self-reflection framework for community engagement in higher education. The idea is that it's a qualitative process, so not metrics-based. We've developed it so that it is multifaceted and context-specific, so it should be able to work at any kind of university, whether you're a small university of applied sciences or the University of Oxford. It should not make any difference. And that cannot be turned into a ranking tool. It's participative. That was crucial to us. It's not a desk-based tick box exercise. It's about having an institutional conversation within the university and with partners about what's being done. And we hope and we like to think that it is innovative. It's different to what's been done before. So let me then try and explain what we've done. So it's a toolbox, which means there are different tools. And the first one is the dimensions of engagement. So this is about understanding the different ways in which community engagement can take place at an institution. And the argument is that it applies to almost virtually any aspect of university activity. And we categorize those into 7 different dimensions, which I will now present one by one briefly. So teaching and learning, community engagement in that context is, for example, about community-based learning, sometimes referred to as service learning, aprendizaje servicio in Spanish and in Latin America. This is a completely mainstream form of learning, by the way, in Latin America, which is interesting. Project-based learning, so ways in which students, during their studies, work with community partners and get learning credits and learning outcomes from that process. In the area of research, this is not just about doing research about communities or research that is useful for communities, but doing research with communities. And this is what Jude was also talking about. So community-based research, there's citizen science is also a form of that. Service and knowledge exchange we refer to as activities that academic staff get involved in addition to their teaching and research activities, so whether it's getting involved in public debates or developmental projects, capacity building projects for community groups. Students is distinct from teaching and learning, so we're looking at students as student organizations, so students independently organizing themselves to be activists, to meet community needs, to have their own projects. To address societal needs. The management, so that means at the central university level, that's about the extent to which the university is open to the community. Are facilities open to the community? Are there resources that are accessible to the community? And then the last two are about the environment in which, at the university, that supports or not this agenda, which is to what extent there are policies and support structures, an office or a working group at the university that supports this. And finally, whether, this is the most abstract one, it's about whether the culture of the university, whether your academic peers think that this is really worthwhile and a robust research, or whether they think it's just something that's a bit silly, really. That's not what we do. So that really depends. It's the least tangible of all, but I think in the conversations it's very clear to people there what they feel is the supportive environment of the university. Okay, so for each of these, we have a set of, we call them sub-dimensions, so it's 20 statements as to what a community-engaged university can be. We don't have to look through those. And then basically what a university does is that it tries to map out what it's doing and examples of what it's doing in these different dimensions. And then you shift to this second tool, which is, we call levels of engagement. And that's so for each of these 20 different areas, there's a conversation within the university about how well are we doing this using a developmental maturity kind of scale from levels 1 to 5, where we have descriptors of level 1 and descriptors of level 5 and level 3. And the basic idea here, which is where our tool is, let's say, a bit more critical than others, is that it's about the level of mutual benefit. At level 1, there's activity taking place, and the university is quite happy with that activity, but there's no real evidence that this is actually having a benefit for the other side, or that the other side is actually included as an equal partner in those relationships. So there might be lots of activity, but the lower levels means that there's not yet a clear, demonstrable mutual benefit, or the community involved has more of a peripheral role than a central role in that process. So in this example, community-based learning exists. In level 1, the students definitely learn a lot in that process, but we don't yet know what has been the effect on the community partners, whereas level 5 is that it's actually really built there's been, through time, an effect that the capacity of those external partners has been built, and the students and the university and the university staff all benefit from that cooperation. After a university does all that, we have this thing called the heat map, which is basically our attempt to reconcile the fact that we as human beings like numbers and like visual representations of things, and that if we keep it to a 100-page report, it might be more difficult to digest. So, but it's an idea of taking the 7 dimensions, and for each of them looking at a few more aspects to really think about how engaged as a university we are. So that's thinking about the authenticity of engagement, to what extent we address a range of societal needs, or we focus more on certain types and not others, let's say labor market needs and not so much on other types of needs. Do we primarily engage with certain types of communities, maybe like large institutions, hospitals and large businesses, but not so much with schools, NGOs and such like? Is it spread around the institution, or is it primarily focused in, let's say, humanities, social sciences? And then finally, is it sustainable in the sense that is there a steady funding stream for this, or is it just based on this project, that project, which could soon run out of funds? Finally, and in our opinion, in a way the most important one, is the conversation then that takes place at the end of this process. We call this a slip dot analysis. We have invented that term. And what is it? It's a SWOT analysis without weakness. So it's, instead of weakness, we talk about areas of lower intensity, which means we as a university don't really do this, but honestly, that's okay that we don't do it, because we don't feel that that's really the priority right now, or that that's really, we have the capacity to do this. But areas with potential for development means we could do better here, and it's realistic that we could do better. And this is a conversation that takes place within the university and ideally with the external partners as well. And so we developed this and we piloted it in during the TEFC project in 4 different countries and 4 universities, and we are doing it now in an extra 3 or 4 countries and universities. It works, in short, is the bottom line. It facilitates a learning journey rather than compliance or competition. It truly raises the visibility of the value that the university brings to communities and vice versa. And I say this because the rectors and vice-rectors that were involved were not aware of 90% of the content of that report and of what the university was doing, because so much of it is based on the intrinsic motivation of certain staff and students. The information does not reach the management often. It does support the intrinsic motivation of those involved, so the discussions that take place were meaningful, fun, and constructive, so it doesn't feel like another kind of, let's say, quite tiresome assessment process. And crucially, we were able to ensure peer learning between institutions to both ensure the quality of that process and a learning experience between institutions. And of course, it provides then a basis for future action planning. Some three final thoughts, three final slides. I was asked by the organizer to say, okay, we're quite STEM people, so could you try and maybe focus the presentation to at least mention where STEM comes in? The response to this question is that actually the videos you've just watched are a great demonstration of that. So I was going to mention the fact that citizen science primarily takes place in STEM fields, and in the field of medical and health sciences, there's patient and public involvement, which is very well developed, and which is a huge area for potential for engagement. And then I was going to give brief examples of from our partner universities. I don't think we need to go through these, but basically ICT, using ICT to help children with disabilities, using robotics to help people with dementia, developing a water-repellent windproof suit for refugees and homeless people, and having, very similar to the mapping thing that we saw in Mozambique and other countries, students going to countries in Asia, Africa, and South America to jointly develop solutions to problems that they've identified. So it is not just something about the social sciences, okay? You could be engaged in any field. Engagement versus impact. This could be a topic of a two-day conference and not of a 60-second slide. The point I'd like to make is that it's not the same thing, but it's closely related, okay? And maybe the briefest way in which we could put this is that engagement is a crucial element of impact. So you get impact by being engaged. And so we call public engagement is often talked of as a pathway to impact. And much of the research assessment that takes place, which is about measuring social impact, actually measures precisely this. To what extent have there been productive interactions with external partners? And that's how impact is measured. So these are very closely related things, but we can talk about this if necessary in the discussion. Final thoughts, final slide. What's the future of this in Europe? We think the future is bright. We think that this is where things are going. So in the latest document within the Bologna process, community engagement as a term has been included in the priorities till 2030. The European Universities Initiative is doing this as well. It's about connecting universities to your local and regional and transnational contexts. We're hoping it's going to feature in the upcoming strategic document, which is coming now from the European Commission. And the EUA and the Council of Europe have also launched new initiatives to support this agenda. So we think that this is the future, and we hope that the framework that we developed can help structure a conversation about this in your universities as well. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jude, and thank you, Thomas, for a very interesting presentation and extremely relevant ones as well. Unite is built up of 7 universities, which has all a strong technical background, so the STEM aspect was, of course, very interesting as well. We have numerous examples of testing or doing research in different community aspects, and also teaching, of course, in various fields. And I was thinking, if I may start with the first question to both of you, we are talking very much about how the university can act and should act and engage, so to say, in this, which is very important, which is the key, of course, for us. when you do this kind of work, sometimes I have a feeling that the stakeholder side is not that well developed, especially if we look for collaborations in Africa or in areas which are less developed, but also in society as such, because well, we work with industry. Industry is very well prepared. They know exactly why they go to universities. They know exactly what they can expect and so on. But do you have any aspects of the stakeholder side in this kind of communication? Do we have to teach them something, or in what way should we act? Jude, please. Well, okay. Thomas, you can.
I mean, I can go first, sure.
Yes,
I mean, that's a very good question, because it has to be a two-side, you know, a relationship with both sides involved, and there can be situations in which the level of trust is not very developed between a university and its community. So I think that in certain situations that can be a very slow process about the university trying to, I mean, not forcing straight away, a kind of forcing someone into cooperating, but actually finding ways in which to slowly build bridges with communities, including people in working groups, inviting people to discussions about what are their needs and is there anything that the university can do to develop those. So I mean, I'd be interested to see Jude's experience, since, Jude, you've worked also in Africa, and you mentioned specifically in your presentation the fact that you can have interventions by universities that actually have a negative impact on partners or on the surrounding area the partners are in. But I think, in short, my response would be a university has to build those bridges. It might be a slow process, but it's just about opening a dialogue with a range of different community actors to listen to what are their specific needs. Is there anything that the university can do to help their specific needs, whatever areas that's in, whether it's in disadvantaged neighborhoods, whether it's industry, whether it's culture, museums, so that it's about, first of all, establishing a dialogue, establishing links, and then defining ways in which you can work together.
Jude, do you have any comments?
Can I,
yes,
can you hear me?
Please.
I think there's a bit of a delay. Yes, I think it's a really important issue, but I'd like to say, in my experience, there are a lot of civil society organizations who are actively engaged with research to very high standards, often comparable to industry and even academia, often surpassing even academic practices. For example, I've worked quite a lot with large international NGOs based in various contexts. And two examples from STEM research: Site Savers International has a very strong research strategy. They conduct research independent of any university and have their own ethical board, which similarly there's a I can't remember, I think it's called Brook Action for Working Horses and Donkeys, which is an animal rights organization. They work on international development and environmental issues, as well as veterinary issues, animal husbandry, animal rights, and also have a very sophisticated ethical body and research strategy and set of research instruments. So there are a lot of organizations from the international right down to national and local levels working in quite sophisticated ways with research. It's just a matter of finding these organizations and, as Thomas says, developing meaningful and sustained relationships with these organizations. In some cases where there isn't necessarily the same capacity, then there is that need, as Thomas raises, to integrate different types of stakeholders into strategic agenda setting around priorities for research and teaching, into peer review or evaluation panels when decisions about what funding should be made available are raised. But it has to be a two-way process. It can't be just about broadcasting knowledge from the university or giving students the opportunity to work alongside different types of stakeholders. It also has to be inviting different groups into setting agendas for research, establishing their needs and priorities for teaching, for students to then go on and be able to contribute more actively to their various social projects.
Thank you very much. Thomas?
I mean, I just wanted to add briefly, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of the science shop. This was invented in the Netherlands, I think in the 1970s, and has since spread around Europe and also around in countries around the world, where there's structures usually that are university-based, but they could be outside, that connect the university to the community. So science shops acts as a point where community groups, civil society, but also others, employers, can contact them and say, we have a specific need. We would like in our community to do research on this. Can you basically lend us some students or researchers that could work on this with us? And sometimes it's funded through projects, sometimes it's actually funded by the external partners, sometimes it's co-funded by both sides. So these are structures that can help that bridge making between the university and the community.
Thank you. I agree. It's very much a bridging between the different partners. One of my questions was really, we are used to, well, we teach and do research, of course, and our product is degree students or students with a degree, or people, so to say. And normally we're used that they are working in the company or in society somewhere. And it's a very slow process, actually. So when you do, the new role of the university is, of course, a little bit more complex then. In what way should the university change, perhaps its management? Jude, you were into this as well as in your presentation, but do you have any practical ideas? We're engineers, you know, and we need practical ideas. How to organize, how to meet the demand in such a way that the Dutch example was a good one, but how to get closer to each other, because that is necessary to get a long-term and trustful relation. Jude, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Yes, I think developing those sustained relationships which link to university strategy and policy as well as discrete teaching and research opportunities is really important. And those don't happen overnight, they take time. I think there are ways to utilize examples like the science shop examples specifically for certain emerging research issues or teaching opportunities. But I think long-term developing partnerships, often formalized, institutionalized partnerships with key stakeholders, allows you to bring in those stakeholders into long-term strategic planning too. So it doesn't happen immediately. You have to cultivate these relationships. But the longer term the relationships, the more you are in tune with the different opportunities and challenges as they arise, as contexts evolve. So I think it's really invaluable to develop that. And practically speaking, that might just involve incorporating representatives from some of these organizations into strategic boards or committees, including non-academic experts as guest speakers, bringing in guest lecturers into teaching programs. In the Open University, where I am based, there's a collaborative mentoring supervision structure. So often you'll have in a team of supervisors, you'll have somebody from outside of the university, and that creates a link into the programming, teaching side as well as research. So there are a lot of practical things that you can do, but it really is about cultivating and nurturing these relationships with organizations as well as key individuals within those organizations.
Comments?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the comment I'd like to make to add to this is that, so you were asking, so what can management do to make this transformation? One input I would have is that from our experience in this project, we've seen that community engagement is happening anyway at the university. It's just that it's not being recognized and supported. So we've seen examples, so in each of the university we saw, including ones where the management was really not interested, let's say, in that aspect. They were interested in the entrepreneurial university, tech transfer, and so on. They weren't really interested and didn't have many schemes to support this kind of engagement. Engagement was still happening because you have intrinsically motivated academic staff, researchers, teaching staff that think that this is a good way of doing teaching. This is a good way of doing research, and this is what's needed. So all a university needs to do, I mean, it's not that easy, but what they can do is to just simply start recognizing what's already there, and recognition can happen in symbolic ways, just by saying, we think this is an excellent practice, and we have an award for the most community-engaged practice, to actually a more sustainable way is to say that we include these kinds of activities as criteria in promotion, tenure, and so on. Or we have a specific strategy that's going to support this. Or we're going to establish an office or a working group or some kind of resource that can help staff working on this and students to further develop this. So the point is, it's happening anyway, and the change is about to what extent, if the management wants to do that change, it's about, there's a range of different options that they have that can be quite radical to ones that are simply just about recognizing and talking more about this topic.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience as well? Don't hesitate. I can talk for some time as well. Oh, here we are. Can you?
Okay, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I have a couple of questions for Thomas. One is concerning this methodology. How long an effort of people it takes to evaluate the performance or the value of the community engagement of a university? I talked to Girona colleagues some weeks ago. They said, "Oof, it's a lot." So is it really realistic? Is it simplifiable, or is it a research project in itself? And linked to that, how often this evaluation do you imagine that should be done? For example, we've been doing in the last 3 years the impact ranking participation, and it's a crazy amount of effort, but then you are so tired that you never have time for improving, because when you have done the photograph, it's time to start again to do the next year. And the second question, this was a package, and the second was, are SDGs somehow integrated or integratable in this frame? Because everyone wants to have SDGs visible now, all the administrations, institutions, universities, alliance. So it would be easy or not to integrate or to make them connected to this framework? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. How difficult is it to do? So there's nothing you can do that's quick in this area. So it's definitely not an easy task, but I'll give you an idea of how it works. So it works that there's a core team of, let's say, 2 to 3 people that do that exercise. And there's usually a working group at the university level that could be from 10 to 20 people involved in that process. In our experience, it's gone between 3 to 6 months as a process, but not like a kind of constant, intense process. But it lasts in total up to 6 months. And basically, it's about collecting practices from around the university. So you have to do a kind of data collection exercise. And in our experience, every university has collected between 40 and 70 kind of practices of community engagement. So the team that's doing it would then have to process this, and then facilitate a discussion about where these practices place the university within the framework that we've developed and what kind of levels. So that does require work. So it is quite an intense process of discussion, and so there's quite a lot of commitment that's required. The experience is that it's been, however, the experience has been that all of those who've been involved in that process have really seen it as a valuable process to be involved in, and that the end product was worth the invested time. What's interesting for us is that we also weren't sure to what extent, I mean, so it's fine if it's funded through a European project, right? But what's going to happen after that? Interestingly, we've received 4 or 5 expressions of interest from universities that are willing to do this by themselves. So with no additional resources required, that they're willing to go through this process. One of them is the University of Antwerp that have almost completed it. There's the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil that are thinking of using it as well. So interestingly, it seems to have, let's say, struck a chord with certain universities that feel that this is the time for them to carry out such a process. So in that sense, it's feasible, but it's work intensive. But I think there is a future for that tool to work independently without external funding. I don't think it's something that needs to be done every year. We haven't yet thought about that, but I would say that there would be no point in doing it more than once every 3 years or something like that, but we're yet to come to that decision. SDGs, very interesting question. We purposefully avoided that, and we had many discussions, and we concluded that a university using this could, in each of the answers, say, this is what we do in terms of engaged teaching and learning, and we address these and these SDGs. But we didn't want to frame the entire tool in that context. So I think it's possible to make those links, but we purposefully decided that we'd make something that will last even longer than the SDGs, so for the next 30 years and not just the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more comments? Yes?
I can't help myself on the loud stream, even if I live in Sweden. Okay, so I was wondering whether we can consider reframing the dialogue, because if we talk about community engagement, we're placing the responsibility on the university to push out to the community. And it's all about the university as as an actor that needs to somehow reach out and engage. And I would like to reframe that dialogue from push to pull, and say that if universities can reframe themselves as being the stepping stone or the relevant actor in helping to reposition society in relationship to the global development or sustainable development goals, or climate change, or the other great challenges that are facing us globally as a species, then what we can do is we can help to reframe the whole dialogue where universities become a resource that establish for citizens an opportunity to take agency in relation to the future. And in that sense, we become relevant not only as an educational institution, but also as an enabler and a bridge to industry, equipping engineers and young people to take control over the future in ways that they have not previously felt that they have control. So I think there's a great opportunity here to reframe this dialogue in another way, and instead of talking about outreach all the time, talk about relevance. How do we make ourselves relevant to the society of the future? Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. That calls for comments from Jude. Do you have any comment?
Yes, I think that's a really important point, and I think it's really difficult. How do you create space within the university for different organisations to draw on the resources that universities have? And this is where the kind of push and pull becomes a little bit ambiguous, because often within engagement activities, there's an assumption that that it might be resourced for academic or university staff, but that people outside of the university will want to engage just because it's of interest to their work. And actually, in a lot of cases, this is over and above what they're doing anyway and uncompensated. So there has to be some resourcing as well, some recognition that if dialogues are to be facilitated between university and different parts of society, that groups, especially more marginalized or disadvantaged groups, are to some extent compensated for their participation. And that's difficult to justify to senior management, so it requires a lot of different conversations about the value of this work within the university too. But I think this is a really exciting time, both because you have, within your student population, you have such a diverse range of both young people experiencing cutting-edge issues, thinking forward to the future, imagining new alternatives for their country and Europe and the world. And you have potential employees, you have potential academics as well within that pot. And when you actually bring together multiple institutions and multiple countries with all their different agendas and opportunities and constraints, you have a dialogue which is both really optimistic and also very critical. And I think what I would say is that while it's important to focus on kind of positive responses to challenges, we have to also be a little bit critical, and we have to look at the implication of both more detrimental national or European policy decisions and of our own institutional policy at the same time, to creating systems which are exclusive to certain groups. And that's why I think thinking a little bit about who these groups are, how they're different, who's represented when we say that we're engaging a particular stakeholder, a particular community, who are we actually engaging within that organization or within that sector, and who aren't we? And how can we actually use our university as a resource for those less included members of that community to have their voice heard and to have their needs and priorities articulated within this space.
Thank you. Any comments from you, Thomas? Or
yeah, sure. I'll add a comment. I mean, I really like your comment, because I like the kind of the visionary nature of it. Like, let's stop talking about reaching out, but let's talking about bringing people in. And I think that kind of shifting the debate is important. Unrelated to this, but interestingly, I saw a post on social media this morning which was saying we need to stop talking about hard-to-reach groups, but talk about groups that are seldom listened to. And I think that's precisely that kind of shift. Let's try and think of ways in which we can bring more people in, rather than ways in which we can, help others or reach out. And I think coming back to this idea, this idea of the science shop, I think those kinds of structures are there to do that. So it's about creating a center that's resourced by people who are paid to be an intermediary between the university, which is a scary institution if you're from the community, right? I mean, it's bureaucratic. You have, you don't feel comfortable contacting a university from outside. If you have an intermediary who can reach out and say, let me connect you, this is a way in which this can be done. So I think that those kinds of solutions are the way forward.
Thank you. One more question over here. Yes.
I just want to, to add on that. I think we already have something like this existing. We just need to transfer it from the economy and industry, because what you're talking about is a partner centricity, and we are talking about key accounts in the end, and we shouldn't limit it just to economy and industry, but you need that key accounts also, like you said, in the different other sectors of society, culture, politics, and you need a kind of organization of the thing, because otherwise it's difficult to handle, because you don't have that key accounts on both sides. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get in the dialogue, and maybe you can just take this idea from the Yeah,
I'm curious, so you said key accounts, is that what you were saying? Because I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that, so could you explain what that is?
Key account is, you know, is somebody, like you just said, that he's responsible for a certain group or a certain partner or a certain partnership within university, but on the other hand, there must be also a key account on both sides to be able to distribute information within the organization and the other...
Brilliant, yeah. So it's about saying, yeah, we have the key accounts for this industry, that industry, that industry. Now let's do it for, you know, schools, museums, community groups, and something like that. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's the way forward. Brilliant. Great idea. Thank you.
I must say as well, yes, a very good idea, Jens. It's actually, we have to learn to meet each other in different ways, and we might have to learn to speak the same language sometimes, which we haven't done. And we have discussed a lot now the different ways of sort of say, well, it's a new situation for us. We are used to work with stakeholders which are well known to especially the technical universities, and now we have to find new ways of how to work with these other stakeholders. And we can do that internally. We can also bring on, as we said with Jude, bring on people into our boards or into our governing platforms, whatever we have, which are suitable, which of course is very important. Any other questions from the audience? If not, no one from the online as well? No? Okay. I think this has been a very interesting session. We have learned a lot, and it's extremely relevant for all of us in Unite as well. I thought, when I was listening to this, I thought that perhaps, well, we have best practices. We learn from each other. But this is an extremely good example of actually trying to come up with something really new, because this is something we can do as Unite, and not only as the single partner universities we have in our network. So this is an opportunity for TF7 to be creative in this context. And I'm really happy that Thomas mentioned that Times Higher is doing the impact ranking. It might have very big, well, it might not be the best way of measuring different things, but if you want, you're all invited to Stockholm, April 26th to 28th, because the next Times Higher Education Innovation Impact Summit will be in Stockholm at KTH those days. And on the Wednesday, they will present the next ranking. And I wonder whether University of Manchester is #1, isn't it, right now? I think so too. But you're all welcome. If not, if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap it up. And thank you very much, Jude. Excellent. And thank you, Thomas. And I hope we can be able to work with you more in the future as well. Thank you now. Thanks all of you for listening.